Good afternoon, Idaho HIMSS members. Welcome to today's webinar. It is my pleasure to introduce Brian Dallover, who is the Director of Solutions Engineering and Healthcare Services at ENA. Brian has more than 15 years of experience in the telecom industry and has played multiple technology and business roles at ENA that include field operations, project management, and engineering. If you have any questions for our speakers today, please enter them in the Zoom chat. Please take it away, Brian.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the intro. Before I dive into today's topic and content, I want to just make a quick introduction to Courtney Pitkin. Courtney Pitkin is our account manager for the Idaho market. I've left her contact information up there if you want to take a second to jot it down. But today is all about contact tracing. And I'm not typically a person who dives into buzzwords, but this is a buzzword that I think is actually worthy of some investment of time in. And so we're going to spend just a few minutes talking about sort of what it is, the use cases for it, and then we'll dig into some of the technology, like how does it actually work? And then finally, we'll finish with what does it take to actually support contact tracing supported by a wireless network. So with that, we'll dive right into sort of what is contact tracing. So there's a number of ways that we could use contact tracing, particularly in the healthcare space. But one of those is to retroactively identify who has come in contact with a patient or someone who tests positive for COVID-19. So you can think about as our world starts to kind of move forward with what we call our new normal now, we have to start considering those kinds of things. Who tested positive? Where were they? Who did they come in contact with? And so contact tracing can kind of help us out with managing that data. Another thing is we can identify congestion and hot zones. So we can actually alert users or enterprises, you can alert your staff, whatever you need to do. You can alert them when there's excessive gatherings in some part of the enterprise. So if you had a social distancing limitation, you say, hey, I can't have more than 10 patients, in the lobby or in the waiting room. You can notify folks who arrive on site that the lobby is full to please wait in their vehicle. You can kind of create some of those notifications to minimize those congestions or hotspots. You can also provide, similar to that, user self-policing. So if someone comes to your site and they're going to enter into an area that's already been identified as a hot zone, you can alert them and you can make it their choice whether they enter or not. So you can kind of communicate that. And that really, jumping over to the right side here, really helps support social distancing guidelines that you might have in place. You can also use contact tracing to just validate entry testing. So you can see who was walking into the building, so you can make sure that you actually have temperature logs for all those different folks. But one of the most important questions we ask when we're trying to do all of these things is, what technology do I actually have to have? The short answer is you really have to have a pervasive Bluetooth Low Energy network on top of a Wi-Fi network to do this well. And we'll talk about that more later. But these are some of the things that really kind of I think can use contact tracing for, and a few things that are required for it. So a lot of times I talk about this and folks go, okay, I understand like the data behind it, but what does this look like? What else can I do with it that would be exciting? So I want to share two use cases with you, and I'll kind of tell a story as we walk through this. The two use cases are really, the first one is wayfinding. So it's really all about, I'm new, I'm walking on to maybe a hospital campus. The example I'll give you is a convention center. I've never been there before. I'm looking for this specific room, and I have no idea how to find it. So in this case, you're going to watch as we walk through this building. Oops, excuse me. We're walking through a building, and I'm trying to locate a conference center's business office. And so you can see on the left side, my mobile device is showing my location on a map of the facility. You can see in the small video here, that's me walking through the building trying to locate it. And on this right side, you're actually looking at the back end of the wireless networks platform, and you're seeing a heat signature of my device's RF coverage as I walk through the building. And it gives me very similar to like a Google Maps type of turn-by-turn direction through a building that I've never been at. So it's like Google Maps for your private environment, helping your users get from where they are to where they need to be. And this does a number of things for you. It tells you about timely arrivals. You can sort of see that, hey, this patient's almost here, or wow, they're really going the wrong way and I need to redirect them. So it's a pretty powerful use case just to have wayfinding supported by your wireless network. So that's one use case that we've seen deployed. That's an actual use case that's out there in the world. The second one actually comes from the Orlando VA, and that's going to be on this video on the right-hand side. So one of the problems they had at the Veterans Hospital was veterans would arrive, for their appointments, and they would pull up into that front driveway that you can sort of see in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. And as they would pull up, they would be in need of a wheelchair, and they couldn't find either an employee or a wheelchair. Sometimes they couldn't find one, sometimes they couldn't find the other, and sometimes they couldn't find either. And so what the Veterans Hospital did is they created a contact tracing supporting mobile app. And so a veteran could arrive on scene, pull up the Veterans Hospital application on their device, and they could actually see where employees were, see where a wheelchair would be, and they could call them together. So we call it like an Uber-like experience, or I call it wheelchair Uber because it's cute. So here we are. I've arrived on site, and I say, gosh, I need some help. And so I identify, oh, look, there's an employee here. I say I need a wheelchair or request that assistance. And you can see that Greg Merrill here on the bottom left has accepted my request for assistance. And you can see that in this case, I'm Jason Edwards. He's working his way across to me. We're both on the first floor, and I can see that wheelchair number 3 is floating right over here. And we're going to see as Greg goes to kind of come out and greet me and ultimately take me to my appointment. So this is a real life use case. It's all using contact tracing technology. And you can kind of see that, hey, has your issue resolved? Have you got the assistance you need? And there's some nice confirmation. So pretty powerful use case for contact tracing technology. You know, maybe you have a smaller facility and those aren't, you know, super useful to you. It's like, hey, we got one wheelchair and it stays in the waiting room. That certainly can happen, but there's still some use cases for contact tracing, as you've seen before in some of the data we talked about. I'll give you some more reports here in a few minutes. So next I'll talk about the underlying technology. So how the heck does this contact tracing thing work? Well, first I want to say this. Sometimes you'll hear contact tracing referred to as proximity tracing. That's the same thing. So if you hear those words used interchangeably, we're talking about the same thing. But in either case, whether you call it one name or the other, the underlying technology is what's most important. So most of the information I'm going to give you today is actually from a vendor that's now owned by Juniper. The original company was called Mist. It's now Juniper, which is Mist is basically the AI and machine learning engine behind it. But they have some proprietary technology. I just want to explain what their technology is to you. So at a high level, they've created an easy to deploy and manage location service. And what they do is they can locate users through Wi-Fi signals. They have a patented, basically a dynamic or virtually controlled Bluetooth low energy array of antennas. It's got 16 Bluetooth low energy antennas inside. And it can use mobile apps and assets. It also has machine learning capabilities, and it eliminates all of the manual calibration that would normally be required in a network that's using location-based services. And so what all of that technology enables them to do through their customized hardware and their software that they've developed through machine learning and AI is they have these patented virtualized beacons. So you can actually have virtual Bluetooth low energy beacons running around all the time. So that's kind of what happens on the network side, but what about the users? What are my sources of contact information from the user? The first one and probably most accurate is a Bluetooth low energy enabled mobile app that is really based on tracking. So we're looking specifically at a mobile app that can then pull Bluetooth data and send that out to the network. The second would be a Bluetooth low energy tag. So it's very similar to like a key fob or an ID badge that has a BLE tag inserted inside of it. Third, we can actually do passive listening to Bluetooth low energy devices. And the first time I heard this, like the hair on my neck sort of stood up. I'm like, oh, that's kind of big brothery. Like I'm not even connected to your network and you can see me. But the answer is yes, because wireless devices beacon all the time at regular intervals. And so whether you're connected to me or not, I have the ability to sort of sniff the air, so to speak, and see who's around me. So the same is true of Wi-Fi. I can look at Wi-Fi connected users, or I can look at Wi-Fi users that are disconnected or not connected to my network, but are beaconing in the area. And so the reason I focused on Mist is that no other vendor in the industry actually has all 5 of these sort of contact tracing source vectors integrated into one solution. Lots of vendors have solutions for location-based services, but there's really not one that can do it all in one box, so to speak, and so you kind of maximize your cost effectiveness, and that's really what we at ENA care about. So here's some technical considerations. If we just were to do location-based services on Wi-Fi alone, first of all, that Wi-Fi would have to always be on, and the user's device would have to always be on. And the accuracy of RTLS, or real-time location services in Wi-Fi, is between 5 and 10 meters. Now, with today's social distancing standard of 6 feet, that's not super helpful, because we're talking about 15 to 30 feet of accuracy. But on the positive side, Wi-Fi is very easy to deploy. It just isn't that accurate. So what we want to do is then take that Wi-Fi location-based services and layer a new level of intelligence on top of it. And so that can be done through a Bluetooth Low Energy badge or a key fob, like I mentioned before. Again, that key fob, thankfully, it's always on, right? It's always going to operate. As long as your BLE network is on, you're good to go. And that brings our accuracy down from 5 to 10 meters down to 3 to 5 meters. So we're getting a little bit closer to what would be considered a safe social distancing standard to kind of see, were we closer than 6 feet? We're at about 9 feet here. The downside is you have to deploy BLE badges, right? And it's not like you're going to hand out badges to patients that they take home, because chances are pretty good you're never going to see that badge again. So that's not really a great idea, so for all use cases. So then we switch over and say, well, what about a mobile app? Can I give folks a mobile app that gives me access to their Bluetooth data as soon as they beacon in my environment, whether that app is running or not? So if y'all have iPhones, I'm not as familiar with Android, but if you have an iPhone, you've probably seen it pops up and says, you know, so-and-so is using your location data. Do you want to continue allowing that, or only while you're using the app? And so based on those settings, you can determine when your location data is available through a mobile app, whether it's open or not. So a couple considerations about the mobile app. First, it enables bidirectional communication. So it can send data to me, but you can send data back out to your patients or your visitors, patrons, whatever. That kind of gives you that nice user engagement where I can then request help. You sort of saw those two examples of that wheelchair Uber or the wayfinding. You have that nice user engagement through the app. You get better analytics when the app is running because you can pull out lots of data through that app. And your accuracy goes from 3 to 5 meters all the way down to that 1 to 3 meter range. So now we're really able to see within 3 feet where people are. So all of a sudden, those notifications about congestion and social distancing limits, those things are really valuable because that's accurate data you can use. The downside is you got to have an app developed. How do you do that, right? And so thankfully, there's plenty of partners out there who can do that for you. So let's look at some of the data that we get if we were to successfully deploy a network that supports contact tracing. So the first thing you would get is user journey mapping. So if you get notified that an individual tests positive for COVID-19, or really, frankly, anything that you might need to alert other users about, you can use the data provided by Mist Premium Analytics platform to get really deep detail on what's going on. So in the graph down here, you can see an individual motion path for a person or a device, technically. So you can see we're using an office building here, so you can see that we had someone visit the engineering and leadership, accounting and marketing areas, but they weren't there very long based on the size of the dot, which kind of represents proximity of time. But then when we go over to where we store our hardware and we kind of do all those things, you can see that it starts to increase. But most of our time was spent down in an area that's labeled as CSQA. So we spent most of our time down there. We can sort of see where people move throughout the building and how long they stay in each area. So that's the first thing. So you can also trace it by all areas visited. And this is, instead of a graphical view, this is just more of a data view. So this really shows you the zones in your buildings or areas that maybe an infected user had visited, which devices, badges, or mobile devices, I should say, were in the vicinity that might need to be alerted. So these are kind of funky names because, again, we're looking at a building. This is real data. But you can see that in the customer support or QA area, there were 11 devices in that area. So if one of my, in the business world, if a customer support agent said, hey, I tested positive for COVID this morning, I can go back and look at all this data. Yeah, I don't have to record it. I don't have to, go back and really dig. It's all stored for me, and it's a quick report. I can say, who was in the customer support QA area on March 3rd at 11 o'clock. And it'll tell me everyone that was there and all of their devices. You can see it says devices close by in here. That could be updated to show names, although we keep that data proprietary outside of the report. So congestion alerting, you can also alert users, as I mentioned before, on congestion so that they can kind of do some self-policing. So I can create, as you can see in this bottom left-hand corner, some rules. So again, we're using a business building here. So we say, okay, the office is our production office. We're looking at the office floor plan, and we just want to look at all zones. And we say, okay, in the main lobby, the max time I've seen someone in there was an hour. That's unfortunate. But the average dwell time is 32 minutes, right? And so I say, how many users are there? 121 of them. And I can see that for each of my different zones. Looking over at the right graphic here, this really shows you visitor density based on time and your capacity limits. So you can see that where I've got this green bar on the top, my capacity limit was set to 40. And, when I'm in the green, I got 9 users there, and on average, they're there for 11 minutes. But as we go further on, you can see that around 11 o'clock, I had 36 people in that same area, and my limit was 40. So it's like, whoa, we got a lot of people here, and they're staying there for about 13 minutes each. And so we really want to start looking at those congestion areas and start making some notifications to those folks and say, hey, we're approaching our limit for congestion. We really want you to try to move on to another area. And we try to help the employees speed people up, get them out of the waiting room, into patient rooms, whatever. So pretty good reporting that you can get there. But they take it even one step further. So one of the challenges we have is public venue dashboards, right? So if I pull up to a facility and I just want to know before I even walk in the waiting room, like how many people are there, you can actually post a QR code that when users scan it with their cell phone, it actually pulls up basically a data point. It can be a floor plan as you see on the left, or on the right-hand side, you can just give them sort of a textual data that says in the waiting room, X number of people. And you can highlight it based on risk levels. This is critical, it's minimal risk, whatever. You can sort of set your own standards there. Another place we've seen this used is in larger healthcare facilities, and frankly, we've seen it in colleges, universities around the country, and school districts as well, to provide to public safety officers. So we've had, in the past, unfortunately, there's been some active shootings, and so with contact tracing technology, you can have the public service officials, the police officers, law enforcement that are showing up on site, you can give them access to this same data. So now not only if I have contact tracing enabled, can I sort of provide this to the users for their benefit, I can provide it to law enforcement or others so they can see where people are in the building and how they're migrating through the facility in real time. It's incredibly beneficial for the safety of our users just by posting something very simple like this for them to utilize. So one of the big questions that often comes up is how in the heck with all this data do you keep my privacy and my trust? It's pretty scary. Like I said before, my hair kind of stands up. It's like, holy cow, if Wi-Fi can do all this, what else do you know about me? Well, not as much as Facebook, I promise. But here's the idea. What the Mist platform does is it enables you to build on the trust you've already earned from keeping people safe through their platform, the success of the Wi-Fi deployment. We would never suggest that all data is impenetrable. It certainly happens. What we do is we collect data in the platform. We store it with no personal health information. It's looking at device data, not personal data. Now, if we need to identify a person who tests positive, we have to understand their device, and that's done through a mobile app, right, something along those lines. And so it never requires access to their health information, and we would never ask them to provide that in order to track their location. That's not how this works. It's all done through standard Wi-Fi and Bluetooth protocols and understanding who owns which devices. That's all we really need to know. And so then we can also sort of give you a tool to track an individual's location in a de-identified manner. So if you said, look, I want contact tracing, but I don't want to know who was who, I just want to know if I had an exposure, you can do that and completely hash the user's information so that no one ever knows who it was. We just know that there was someone here who had COVID-19, or even less, probably more important, I should say, not less important, but more important, hey, I'm hitting my social distancing limit. So you wouldn't really be looking for a specific user in this case. You're just looking to follow some general guidelines. And in that case, you can do that in a de-identified manner without any risk. So I don't work for Mist. I'm not giving you a sales pitch on Mist. That's not my intention, but I do want you to understand what it looks like from a location-based services across the industry. So as I said before, pretty much all the major vendors can do this, but they do it in different ways. So a Cisco or Meraki can definitely not only deploy quality Wi-Fi, but great location-based services. But to get down to that 1 to 3 meter accuracy level, you have to deploy an overlay network of Bluetooth Low Energy. Nothing wrong with doing that. If you're well invested in a Cisco network, your skill sets are in Cisco, that's probably the right choice, ultimately. Aruba and Meraki are very much the same way. They require overlay systems to do Bluetooth beaconing, and some of them have some limited subsets of features. So in the Meraki case, you really can't look at the number of client devices. That would represent physical devices a patient's carrying. You can't identify those by zones. All you can see is that they're in the area, right? And so you can't say this zone is a patient room or a waiting room. It just says you've had X number of people in your facility. So it's not quite as useful for some of the use cases we're talking about, but it's still an absolutely acceptable use case for location-based services. What you can't get with the other vendors is that user journey tracking or true contact tracing, where I can see all of the details about who was where and how close they were to each other. And the reason for that is very simple. We go back to that Wi-Fi accuracy when we look at real-time location services. It's 5 to 10 meters. Well, if I don't know how close you are within 30 feet of me, it's pretty tough for me to trace a user and their contact with someone else. And so that's why we really say that if you're looking for true contact tracing technology and you don't want to do that with an overlay network, Juniper and Mist today is the only vendor who can do that. And I want to be totally transparent about that, not as a sales pitch, but to make sure that we're not trying to sell you something that you can't get access to. It's there. You can do it through your current vendors if you have Cisco, Aruba, or Meraki. If you don't and you're looking for a refresh, Juniper and Mist would be your best bang for the buck. Just being totally transparent on that. So shifting gears for a second then. So what does it take to do all this? I like the technology. The use cases are exciting. I definitely need that. I love the level of data that they give me, even though it creeps me out a little bit. I know that I need to either upgrade my Cisco, Aruba, or Meraki network, or potentially I need to just replace it with Mist. So what does it take to actually do that? Well, the baseline answer is that any successful contact tracing network is going to require really high quality Wi-Fi before it's ever going to work well. And so I'll dig into a couple of things that we believe are just critical to a good Wi-Fi network. First thing is it always starts with design. If we fail to plan, we plan to fail. So a bad network design is going to lead to a number of problems. The ones that we most commonly hear is that the network is slow. Right? I've heard people say, oh, this Wi-Fi is awful. And I always sort of chuckle. I'm like, how do you know? Have you looked at the Wi-Fi? I used to jokingly walk into customers' environments and I'd look up in the air kind of weird. And they're like, what are you doing? I'm like, oh, I'm just checking your Wi-Fi, right? It's invisible. You can't see it. I have no idea if the Wi-Fi is bad or not. But we hear that all the time. The Wi-Fi is slow. Another problem is that we waste a ton of money trying to fix that, right? So we have a problem with a poor network design, and so we just spend money trying to add more access points, or I'm going to throw a new antenna over here, or a new AP here, and before you know it, we've got what I jokingly call the Oprah Winfrey model. It's like everybody gets an AP, we just throw APs all over the place. Well, these things aren't free. And so because they're not free, we probably wasted a ton of money in areas we don't need to. And sometimes we spend a ton of money and we still have spotty coverage. So we really need a quality plan and design up front to eliminate some of those issues, because ultimately what those things lead to is a frustrated user and an IT team that's losing their minds. And I know because I've met a lot of them, right? So bad network designs, they usually stem from a couple of pervasive myths about Wi-Fi. And I'm just going to talk about some of the things, just try to eliminate some of the myths that you may have heard over time, and try to give you some good kind of tips on what to look for in a quality Wi-Fi plan. So first and foremost, you need to have some set of coverage objectives for your wireless network. When I talk about coverage, this is where I'm just thinking of like a blanket, right? There's nothing worse than going to sleep and waking up and your blankets are halfway off you, right? Like you're freezing to death, you're not a happy user. The same is true of Wi-Fi. If I need Wi-Fi coverage, I want it to cover me up like a heated electric blanket. I want to be so cozy in that coverage, I don't ever want to leave. That's what our devices want to feel from the Wi-Fi network. So we think about two types of coverage in that case. The first is we want to blanket them with what we call primary coverage. And coverage is measured in this term that the acronym is RSSI. It stands for Receive Signal Sensitivity Indicator. I know that's nerdy. You don't need to remember it. Think of this as power level. So the recommended power level for a primary coverage area is negative 65 dBm. If you're a note taker and you're going to buy Wi-Fi networks at some point in the future, that's a number you probably write down. You want to be at negative 65 dBm in areas where coverage is critical for you. If you have a big facility where you need more than one access point, then we want to think about coverage and overlap, because we want to be able to support mobility or roaming. So there's nothing worse than a healthcare practitioner or provider that's got a mobile device that they use for their EHR system, but they leave a patient room and it disconnects from the Wi-Fi, right? I don't want that. I want to make sure that they have seamless coverage as they move around my facility. And so in roaming areas, so hallways, what we call transient zones, anywhere where a person's passing through but they're not really staying there to work, we want the Wi-Fi signal to go down by about 5 decibels. So we want to be about negative 70 dBm in those transient or roaming areas. The reason for that is fairly simple, but if you look at the graphic on the right here, you can see that my device on the left has an established association, and it moves out of its primary coverage area into one of those sort of transient zones. I want the signal level to drop enough that my device is enticed to look for a stronger signal or a better network to connect to. And that can be trickier with different devices. Like I'm a huge Apple fanatic, but they have a couple of challenges, and one of them is that they're really proud of the Wi-Fi signal they've established. If you leave a coverage area, they want to hold on to that signal as long as possible. And so we want to entice them to roam because it's really that device's decision to roam. We entice them by lowering the signal in those areas so they kind of find something better on the other side. A couple other coverage considerations we want to think about, and this is really about channel planning. So for the purposes of this little drawing, I just used the 2.4 gigahertz band of Wi-Fi. And I know that's a little bit nerdy, but there's 3 non-overlapping channels, what they call them. So non-overlapping channels just means that I've got 3 channels that can't interfere with each other. That's plain and simple what that means. And I want to try to maintain a very low level of what they call co-channel interference, or interference that I hear on my same channel. So if you look at that diagram that I've got up here, you can see that I've got 2 blue circles, coverage areas, that are both on channel 1. Think this, that's bad. Anytime that I have 2 areas that are on the same channel that they can hear each other, what that means is every device connected to it is actually sharing that one channel. And so we want to minimize co-channel interference because it really leads to poor performance of a Wi-Fi network if our channel interference starts to rise. The second thing I want to think about, outside of, or third thing I should say, there's coverage, there's co-channel interference, and then there's capacity requirements. What level of bandwidth do I need to provide my users? I'll be honest, if this is guest network, right, if you're just providing, access for your patients to come in and browse Facebook or scroll through Instagram or read the news or whatever, best effort's totally acceptable for that. We have some suggestions on how to do that, but essentially it's a best effort network. But if you have patients come in that are going to be using a device that you provide, or maybe their own device for a telehealth session, maybe they come into a market and, I live in Star, Idaho, or Fruitland, Idaho, and the specialist I need is in Boise, so you're going to do a telehealth session with that person. We want to make sure that they have adequate capacity for that session to actually stream smoothly. Right? One of the use cases I had, and this is not related to Wi-Fi, but it speaks to the importance of telehealth. I did some work with a company y'all may be familiar with, Intermountain Imaging, back in the day in Boise, and they had a number of doctors that worked at the stroke center at St. Alphonsus. And they needed to be able to view a literal scan, an imaging session of a brain as soon as the patient, had the MRI completed, essentially. So once that was done, they would have to go back and then view that. And, you've seen these kinds of things, you're looking through it, and as you're moving through the different layers of tissue in the brain, you don't want to miss a layer because your session all of a sudden, has a glitch, or you drop a packet or two and you miss something that's critical to someone's life. So the capacity requirements here in wireless are just as critical, right? We may not be dealing with that exact use case, but we want to make sure if we're offering telehealth, that session is smooth, the audio is heard, and any video that's required stays consistent throughout our session. The third thing is airtime demand within a cell. This is a little bit nerdy, probably not a big issue in a lot of healthcare environments, but here's the idea. We want to limit the number of users that are connected to one access point at any given time. A lot of vendors will give you like fancy numbers and they'll say, oh, my access point can support 512 users at one time. That's not realistic because we know that we have limited bandwidth available, and so we really want to limit airtime to make sure we're providing the capacity requirement that our patients are ultimately going to need. So how do we do that? Well, the way we do it is channel planning. So we try to look at our ability to reuse channels because there's a limited number of channels that don't have interference with each other. We want to try to reuse those, and that's affected by the number of radios that we have as well as the width of the channel that we set up. So channel width, if that's a new concept for you, just think wider channel means more bandwidth, so generally a good thing. But the problem is when you widen a channel, you're actually using another channel. So you're kind of combining channels, and so you have less channels available to reuse. When you have less channels to reuse, that means you have higher risk of interference between your access points. That means more noise, that means more junk, and it means that your network actually slows down. So this is why it's so important for us to plan, right? I can't just say, oh my gosh, I need contact tracing. This Mist company that this Brian guy told me once says they've got it. I'm going to buy a bunch of APs, slap them on the ceiling, and I'm good to go. Well, that's not really true. We've got to think about our coverage like we talked about. We've got to start planning for our channels, figure out what channel width we need, manage our noise floor, and then we can start to actually deploy a network that supports that. Then we talk about capacity, which I've mentioned a couple of times here. So how do you determine capacity? Well, step one is coming up with an internal service level agreement for what it means for a client to have adequate throughput. So what is adequate throughput? Well, that depends on what you're using, what the application is, right? If all I want to do is stream 4K YouTube, I've made quite a bit of bandwidth, right? But if I'm doing telehealth sessions, my telehealth vendor probably has a recommendation that says, hey, on that client device that you've chosen to deploy, we really need it to have 5 megabits in each direction in order for it to have a smooth session. That's great to know. We want to know that. And I say telehealth specifically because oftentimes those sessions are encrypted, and encryption has overhead. So we need to really think about the bandwidth, the overhead of that bandwidth, and really plan for that. So that's step number one, is figuring out what level of speed or bandwidth do I need to provide for my users in order for them to have a good experience. And then from that, we develop our radio frequency or RF plan to support that. So we figure out which devices can support it, right? It might be great to have, iPad minis in your environment because they're small, they're easy to store, the batteries charge fast. But the problem is iPad minis, the latest one is a few years old, and it doesn't support some of the benefits that you can achieve, or that you can benefit from, in newer Wi-Fi standards like 802.11ax or AC Wave 2. So you want to make sure we look at what client devices support that SLA, can actually transmit enough bandwidth that will get my users what they need. And then from that, we'll determine the appropriate channel width and how many access points you need. The nerdy way to say that is the access point or radio density, but I really just want to figure out, you don't want a vendor walking in and looking at every patient room and going, oh, okay, you got 10 rooms, you get 10 access points. That doesn't work. What you really need is the appropriate number to limit co-channel interference, but still provide good coverage. Our view on this, being totally agnostic to vendor, we want to sell you as few access points as possible to provide the coverage you need, because that saves you money and it's actually going to reduce interference, which gives you a better network. So that's kind of our view on that. Okay, so how do you, if that's my plan, so I try to figure out my client throughput, let's just say I know I want X amount of megabit per device, then I got to look at my supported client devices. So let's jump into an example, kind of show you what that looks like. And again, this is a little technical, but I'll touch the high level points. So down on the bottom of this graph, I've got 3 devices listed. I've got a Kindle Fire 7, I've got a Chromebook, which are becoming more and more common, and then I have a MacBook Pro, which I think are also fairly common. Not a lot of folks spend $2 or $3 grand on a laptop, but if you do, it's typically a MacBook Pro. So looking at the data points, you can ignore all the other text. I'll just kind of talk through this. On the bottom, the numbers 0, 2, 4, 6, up to 12, that's megabits per second. And you can see my Kindle Fire 7 in one scenario at the very top here. It can achieve about 3 megabit per second, roughly. But then you see it's totally absent from the bottom 2 sections of my bars on this graph. And the reason is that's all the Kindle Fire 7 is capable of doing. Even if I bought the latest and greatest wireless access point from the most expensive, fanciest vendor, the Kindle Fire 7 just can't use it. And so we have to think about what the client device is capable of so that we don't overblow our budget trying to buy this fancy new network when really I needed to upgrade my client devices I'm offering in my building to my healthcare practitioners or to my patients. The same is true of Chromebooks or MacBooks. They all have different limitations. You can see that the very bottom section here talks about co-channel interference. You can see it says CCI of 2. That just means 2 devices are on the same channel and can hear each other. What that does, if you look at the middle graph, is it cuts the bandwidth in half when you go down to the bottom graph. So we're just saying, hey, a MacBook Pro should theoretically, in the scenario I'm giving you here, achieve 10 megabit per second. But if you've got interference, you can cut that in half. It's going to land at 5. So you have 2 things to really worry about. What is your device capable of, and what level of interference do we have? If you get those 2 things right, you're going to have a pretty solid wireless network. So another thing to think about is client segmentation. So if I have a bunch of users come in, let's say that my waiting room is big, I've got 30 or 40 people in there, and they're all using my guest Wi-Fi at the same time. Boy, that can get pretty slow. And then you start getting complaints about a nice service you're offering for free, right? I always kind of chuckle when someone complains about free Wi-Fi. And I'm like, well, I mean, you got what you paid for, right? Like, it was free. Not like you paid to build it, So it's kind of this tough situation. But the truth is, you want people to have a good experience when they're on your guest network. You don't want to be sarcastic like I am, right? So the way that we manage that is we segment your clients into what we call different collision domains. The non-nerdy way to say that is we just break them up into separate channels. We put some users on one channel and some users on another channel. Really, the way to say this is that what we're trying to do is we're trying to separate users by one of 2 things. Either spatial separation, they're so far apart from each other that their devices can't communicate, or we put them on separate channels where they're using that channel dedicated and they can't hear the other person anyways. The reason that matters so much is it speaks to that airtime thing I mentioned before. It reduces our contention because the less users we have on a channel, the more frequently each user gets to speak and communicate. That increases the available airtime, and ultimately it increases the network capacity. So that's what we're trying to do with client segmentation. So I'll summarize those because I know that was a lot of technical stuff. And if you're anything like me, like my eyes start to glaze over like Krispy Kreme donuts after I hear a bunch of technical stuff. So let's just summarize what that actually means. So capacity is driven by three things: the devices you have or your mix of clients, the available airtime that each of those devices has, and how you're able to reuse your channels or frequencies without introducing interference of some type. That's pretty much the bulk of building a high capacity network. There's a common misconception though. This is one of those myths that we hear all the time, that people will go, man, the Wi-Fi is slow, or I've got a really crappy Wi-Fi in my office, right? I have a very good friend who's a dentist, and I've gone to his office before, and he's like, man, the Wi-Fi is terrible in my office. And what most people would do in that scenario is go, okay, I'll just throw an access point up there. But the problem is it actually makes the issues worse in two of those three things I mentioned. It reduces available airtime because that access point needs a channel, right? And it also, because it needs a channel, creates a problem with interference because now I'm reusing a channel that I might be using somewhere else. So the takeaway I want you to get from this kind of long drawn out section about design is you really have to have a client-focused RF design. Your design for your wireless network has nothing to do with your building, what the manufacturer, well, it has to do with your building. It has to do with your building and what the patient needs in the building. It has less to do about the manufacturer or the partner or service provider you're buying from. So focus on the client, your use cases. That's really the best way to avoid those long-term issues. So I want to share these bullets. I'll leave this one up for a second as I kind of talk through it, just to summarize everything I talked about in the Wi-Fi space. So if you want to do a really good wireless design, step number one, determine your client's needs. So what do your patients actually need? What are they using it for? What's the use case? Like one of my favorite things I've ever heard is I was at a conference back when we, used to be able to go to conferences. And one of the vendors said, hey, you can get gigabit Wi-Fi over our equipment. And I immediately leaned in, right? I didn't have to lean in that far. I've got big ears. But I leaned in because I wanted to hear what was going on, right? And this guy's talking about gigabit Wi-Fi. And the first question that someone asked, and if they hadn't asked, I probably would have, it was, does anybody have a use case where you need gigabit connectivity and Wi-Fi? Because typically if you have something that needs a gigabit connection, you plug it in, right? Because Wi-Fi can't actually sustain a gigabit consistently. It's just not capable in today's environment. And you go to Best Buy or Target or wherever you shop at, and you look at a wireless router, and it'll say 4.9 gigabit per second. It's like, yeah, okay. Like your marketing team did a really good job, but realistically, that's not achievable. So instead of focusing on that marketing and trying to achieve that gigabit or that 4 gigabit, whatever's advertised in the box, just think about what your users need. What do they actually need to have a good experience? Because ultimately, perception is really what defines the quality of a network. So to do that, once we understand what our clients need, then we build an RF design that supports that. So we're going to figure out what devices we can support. Hey, if somebody's bringing their own device, all you can really give them is best effort service. But if you're providing a device, let's figure out the best ones to support their needs. From that, you determine an appropriate channel width, figure out how many access points you need around the building. And then there's this misconception that automated technologies do a really good job at managing a Wi-Fi network. And I won't discredit that, but what I'll say is automated technologies don't work as well when they're on their default settings. So you want to standardize your default settings. I won't get into the math behind this, but I wanted to put these two bullets up here that we recommend. There's two different channel spaces you can use in Wi-Fi. There's the 2.4 gigahertz and there's the 5 gigahertz. There's a lot of differences, but one of the primary differences is how they penetrate. A 2.4 gigahertz signal travels a lot further than a 5 gigahertz signal does, just because it's a higher frequency. And so what these two bullets are saying is, hey, I want those two frequencies to actually cover roughly the same size cell. And so these two numbers, you can see the 14 decibels, 8 decibels, or I also wrote it down in milliwatts. That essentially, if you set the automated technology to use those power levels first, what it does is it keeps your cell size the same regardless of which channel space you're using. And that allows the automated technology to run a lot smoother. So a little bit nerdy. I apologize for that. I'm a nerd. I can't help it. But I just wanted to put those out there for you to take a peek at later. And then finally, there's another thing that we haven't talked about yet that I just want to mention. A lot of folks go, well, what about traffic management? What about filtering the traffic that's on my network? What about quality of service? Those are great, but you don't want to worry about those until you get all these other things we talked about right first. Get that quality network design, tune your automated management technologies, right? Make sure you're meeting the needs of your users, and then use traffic management features like quality of service and making sure you're setting the proper queues for quality of service after the fact. And what that does is that takes a good Wi-Fi network and it turns it into a great Wi-Fi network. And that's going to support the contact tracing technologies that you really want to deploy. So I won't spend a ton of time on this because I know our time is almost up, but I just want to mention a few areas where Courtney and I can help. What we really do is we build tailored Wi-Fi solutions that support our most critical use cases. That's really what we're good at. As a company, we do that, and we built our business on exemplary customer care. We care more about the customer's experience than the technology we're using. We often say that we're vendor neutral and technology agnostic. We don't really care what the technology or vendor is. We're going to pick the best one for you, even if we have to swap it out later on down the road. So what that's led to is since 2007, we've had a 99% customer satisfaction rate. And if you're familiar with Net Promoter Score, it's essentially a measure of how many folks would promote you to their friends or colleagues. Average industry scores are somewhere in the 40 for someone like us. We score an 88, which is a world-class Net Promoter Score. I tell that to you just to say the customers that we have, they're happy, they stay with us, and we're glad that they do because we want to continue to meet their needs long into the future. So by doing things that way, we've grown our business to serve over 8,000 community anchor institutions across the country. A simple statistic says that 1 out of every 12 public school students is served by some E&A technology. Now that accounts for school districts, over 685 of them, about 400 libraries, and about 800, a little bit more than 800 healthcare facilities around the country. And that's across 35 states. So to be successful in markets like that, we really have to do a good job of taking care of our customers, as I mentioned before. And we do that through a support model that's just world-class. We have our own Customer Technical Assistance Center. We call it our CTAC. They're 24/7 by 365. It is not staffed with ticket takers. Right? I know y'all have had this before. I worked for a cable company that might serve the area where many of you live. And at that cable company, the first question that was asked every time someone picked up the phone was, have you rebooted it? That's not what our CTAC does. Our CTAC is staffed with engineers who are certified and have the access and ability to resolve issues on the first call. And that's led to a 93% first call contact solution. We don't have to call our customers back with issues. When you call in, one of those engineers is going to answer within 25 seconds on average. And most of the time, you won't have to call us because in 99% of actual issues, we call the customer before they call us. So we're really big on delivering that experience. So where do we do Wi-Fi services? Obviously in the state of Idaho. We held a state contract with the state of Idaho for a number of years. We deployed Wi-Fi for all the high schools in the state of Idaho probably 6 or 7 years ago, and then we did one with Apple. That's probably the major feat of that is getting Apple to sign a contract with you. It took over a year to work with the legal departments to get that done. But what that did was it rolled out our Wi-Fi services across the country. So we have references all over the country. If you want to talk to any of our customers, we'd love to share that information with you. Just reach out to Courtney. We'd love to tell you what we've done for our customers or other folks that might be similarly situated to you. Just a reminder, Courtney Pitkin is the Account Service Manager for Idaho, so if you have any questions that I'm not able to answer today, I can flick her contact information up here in just a moment. But before I do, I just want to say thank you for your time today. I hope that this was valuable for you. At this point, I will pause for a moment and take any questions, and I've got the chat up just in case.
Great job, Brian. One question that's come in, Troy says, there are many benefits to this privacy question. The effort to build trust to get enough people to participate in contact tracing with healthcare could be a lot of squeeze for the juice. What are the most successful inroads in healthcare contract tracing in use today?
Wow, that's a great question. Troy, thanks for the question. Probably, first of all, you're right. It is a lot of squeeze for the juice. It's a lot of work because people are really scared. The first foray that we have seen be successful is to do it while we're de-identifying the user. So Oftentimes, if we're giving out access to Wi-Fi or to an app of some sort, there's an acceptable use policy built into that. And so what we do is in the AUP, we describe how we use customer information, just like you would with your privacy practices for an HCP facility, right? And so we would take those practices and make it clearly documented how we're going to use it. Step one, to really get that inroad, is to say, hey, we're doing this for your safety. We're tracking users that come in and out so we can be aware of COVID-19 exposures. Your specific information is not used. We are looking at an encrypted name of your device. We cannot see who you are or what you specifically did. We can just see a device. That's been the most successful one. It starts out with basic data. I sort of hate to say this. It's certainly not a bait and switch. We don't want to start that way and then flip it on them. But what you really want to do is be honest with them that we can see your devices, whether we're doing contact tracing or not. But what we choose to do is to de-identify. We don't want to look at your personal health information. There's no connection to our EHR system. Your health data is completely safe and disconnected. We want to track devices, and we're looking for proximity between you and other users. That's been a fairly successful message that we've seen. I sort of hesitate to say this, but I don't remember the last time I actually looked at an AUP. I just clicked agree. So it's more about a conversation than it is about just putting it in writing. So I hope that's helpful, Troy. If not, I'm happy to watch for a follow-up question there.
Brian,
you're welcome.
Another question. In your experience, how motivated are large healthcare facilities to adopt contact tracing? And if they're not motivated, how should they be thinking about contact tracing post-pandemic?
Yeah, great question. So I would say it's a bit of a challenge to answer it sort of generally. So without giving a gross generalization, I'll just share a couple of examples. I would say in general, the larger the facility, the more risk averse they tend to be. And so getting into contact tracing is scarier for them initially until we can help them understand how we utilize the data. The best way to do that is actually look at a demo of a contact tracing platform. So whether that's Cisco, Aruba, Mist, it doesn't matter. Get a demo of their platform and actually see the data. That's step one. Once you see what they're actually able to obtain, then the comfort level sort of comes down, goes up. Because the first time we talk about contact tracing, no doubt about it, like I said before, my skin kind of crawled. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is really scary stuff. But when you actually see a demo of the data and you see how it uses it and how it really does de-identify the users, all of a sudden that risk starts to kind of peel away, so to speak. So I would say in the larger the institution, the more risk averse they tend to be. However, we're seeing some large healthcare facilities, even in the state of Idaho, interested in contact tracing and trying to figure out how to do it with different technologies. We've got some folks who are saying, hey, I really like contact tracing, but Wi-Fi doesn't really work in my facilities. I won't share the specific customer name, but we're working with a customer in a state that works in corrections. So they provide telehealth services in correctional facilities. And they're trying to figure out, if we give someone an iPad or a device that's, they're in a corrections facility for a reason, we don't want to give them that device and then not know what they're doing with it, where they're going, and not having visibility to kind of what happened there. And so contact tracing is a great use case. But if you've been to a prison, hopefully to visit, they're concrete and they're steel, and Wi-Fi doesn't go very far. And so they have to look at other technologies like LTE or cellular. And so we've helped some customers out with private LTE and trying to blend that with Wi-Fi and the benefits of contact tracing. So it really varies based on the use case. Some large customers are really interested in contact tracing, but they're risk averse. Others really have less risk, but they're just trying to figure out how to do it at a facility of their scale, because sometimes Wi-Fi just frankly is too expensive to build out into really large facilities. And so a cellular technology typically works better in that environment.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you, Brian.
Sure. Happy to help.
Well, as you can see in the chat, Courtney put her contact information in there. Feel free to reach out to Courtney if you have any questions, or if you want to get in touch with Brian. Thanks to everybody at ENA for doing this webinar today. Sure appreciate it. And for Idaho HIMSS members, we'll see you next month, March 3rd, for our next webinar. Thanks again, Brian, Courtney.
You bet. Thank you. Happy to do it.